pretty much anything you can imagine in the Philadelphia and Southeast PA region. So this includes stuff like organizing cleanups, advocating for specific petitions, getting people's signatures, working on events like this to really let you know about different things that are going on in the environmental community. Learn more how you can access benefits from, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act and all these great bills that are trying to give you the ability to take advantage of those actions and save money and be more environmentally friendly. So that's our organization. And we have a great presentation here about hydrogen, which I know for many is quite a mystery as a new and upcoming energy source. So we're going to hear directly from Kanika and Jessica, who work closely with Climate Action PA. And then we're also going to hear from Sean O'Leary of the Ohio River Valley and hear more from him. So we're going to give everyone a chance to speak, but I'm going to throw it over to Jessica right now. And please, if you have any questions while we're going, just throw them in the chat and hopefully they'll get answered. So thank you guys for coming and we can't wait to start this event.
Hello guys, my name is Jessica. I'm here at the Climate Action. So today we will talk about hydrogen and explore Pennsylvania's future. Next slide, please. So we'll do a quick overview. We're gonna first talk about what is hydrogen, and secondly, we'll talk about what are hydrogen hubs, and then we'll go talk about current development of hydrogen capacity in Pennsylvania. Next, we'll have our speaker Sean to talk about economic development and the petrochemicals for the hydrogen. And next, we'll go for the Q&A sections, and at the end, we'll do our closing remarks. Okay, so what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is a relatively clean energy. When consumed in a fuel cell, produces only water. And it can be produced from a variety of domestic resources, such as natural gas, nuclear power, biomass, and renewable power like solar and wind. It can also be used in cars, in houses, and in many more applications. Today, hydrogen fuel can be produced from two methods. The most common method today is natural gas reforming, which is thermal process, and electrolysis. Next slide. Yeah, so we'll now talk about types of hydrogen. There are actually many different types of hydrogen, and not all hydrogen is created equal. Each type of hydrogen is produced in a different way and has its own unique characteristics. For instance, brown hydrogen is produced through gasification. The black and brown hydrogen are the absolute opposite of gray hydrogen in the hydrogen spectrum, and it is most environmentally damaging. Next, gray hydrogen is created from natural gas or methane. It is using steam methane reformation, but without capturing the greenhouse energy made in the process. Currently, this is actually the most common form of hydrogen production. The third one is blue hydrogen. It is produced mainly from natural gas using a process called steam reforming. Blue hydrogen is sometimes described as a low carbon hydrogen. So it's the carbon emission it emits is relatively low. And turquoise hydrogen is made using a process called methane pyrolysis to produce hydrogen as solid carbon. The main advantage for this type of hydrogen is that it's significantly less energy intensive compared to water electrolysis. And the last one, of course, is green hydrogen. It produces zero carbon, and the green hydrogen is made by using clean electricity from renewable energy sources such as solar and wind power. Yes. Go next. This is just a picture showing the production process. As we can see, green hydrogen is made by using clean electricity, and then electrolyzers use an electrochemical reaction to actually split water into its components of hydrogen and oxygen, and it creates zero carbon. Next. So what are hydrogen hubs? As we know, President Biden recently announced that 7 regional clean hydrogen hubs would be selected to receive $7 billion in bipartisan infrastructure law funding to accelerate the domestic market for low-cost clean hydrogen. The regional clean hydrogen hubs, those are actually networks of clean hydrogen producers, consumers, and connective infrastructure that will help accelerate the large-scale production and the use of clean hydrogen. Pennsylvania actually became the only state to secure 2 regional hydrogen hubs. They are Mid-Atlantic hydrogen hubs and Appalachian hydrogen hubs. I think Kanika will dive into those hydrogen hubs in detail in the next. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. So just going a little bit deeper into the hydrogen hub. So um, in October, Pennsylvania became the only region to secure 2 regional hydrogen hubs. This comes from a $7 billion federal fund, which is going to be shared across 7 hydrogen hubs that have been um, okayed by the Biden administration. Nearly 80 consortiums applied to the funding. However, Pennsylvania became a leader by securing the 2 regional hydrogen hub projects. The first one was the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub with a $750 million investment. This hub is going to use clean hydrogen production facilities from renewable and nuclear electricity using electrolyzer technologies. And the second one, which is the Appalachian Hydrogen Hub in the Appalachian region, has an investment of $925 million, estimated to have jobs of about direct and indirect jobs of about 21,000. And this is one of the hydrogen hub that is going to use low-cost natural gas to produce hydrogen, but they also have plans to store the associated carbon emissions. Moving forward, this is just an overview of the state incentives and the law and regulations that currently exist within Pennsylvania related to green hydrogen or just in general hydrogen production. For example, the alternative fuel vehicle rebate and incentive grants for alternative fuels, zero emission vehicle grant. Moving on to a little bit of the laws, just to give everyone an idea of how Pennsylvania has already started thinking about the state and incentives and laws and regulation to make sure that hydrogen becomes one of the more easily used fuel in the future. Moving on, I'm going to quickly introduce our speaker for today. So we have Sean Leori with us, and Sean is a senior researcher for energy and petrochemicals at the Ohio River Valley Institute. And he is a native of Wheeling, which is in West Virginia. He has written extensively about the role of coal and natural gas in economies of Appalachia in a book, in a column, and a blog called The State of My Space. I'm going to give it to him to take this further from here. And then we'll wait for questions at the end of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kanika. And hello, everybody. And I'm going to share my screen here, if I may. Whoops. There. And let me do the slideshow. Well, it says it's loading. There it is. Well, thank you, everybody, the folks at the League of Conservation Voters for having me. It's a very, very interesting time with the 2 hydrogen hubs that touch Pennsylvania. because there's a lot of misunderstanding about them, both their significance, their size, their impacts, both environmentally and economically. And so I'm hoping today, as we talk through this, we can get a better sense of proportion about what the hydrogen hubs mean, what they don't mean, and frankly, about the likelihood that they'll come to fruition in anything like the form that has been presented to us as a vision for them. Because going back to what Kanika was describing just a moment ago, we know that the two hubs, Mach 2 and Arch 2, have received federal funding or will receive federal funding, about $750 million in the case of Mach 2 and a little over $900 million in the case of Arch 2. And what's interesting is I talk to people, many of them kind of assume that because the two hydrogen hubs have received federal funding, that the realization of those hubs is basically a done deal, that it's going to happen. And I want to just let you know from the outset that that is far, far from a certainty, because while hundreds of millions of dollars sounds like a lot of money, in fact, the federal funds that DOE has earmarked for these two hubs and for the hubs nationally, all 7 of them, represents only about 5% of the capital that will have to be raised in order to build out the hubs and fulfill the visions that have been shown to us. And there is a distinct possibility that that won't happen, or that it will happen only in part. And that's of significance because I'm sure many of the people on this call are active on the question of the hubs and whether or not we should welcome them, and whether or not or to what degree we should subsidize them, because there are calls for more subsidization. So this is simply me letting you know that just because the two hubs have received quite a lot of federal funding, it does not mean that their realization is inevitable, and in fact, far from it. And we'll see some of the reasons why in a moment. Probably the most important thing, I think, for us to take away from at least my portion of today is that because the hydrogen and carbon capture, because those two technologies are economic only for a few applications, and that those applications generate relatively little demand, the Appalachian and Mach 2 hubs will either, on the one hand, be relatively small affairs that have disappointingly little economic or environmental impact, or, and this is the more concerning scenario, hydrogen and CCS, carbon capture, may be force-fed into applications for which they're not economic. And if that happens, it will result in higher prices, higher utility bills, and higher taxes, again, with little or no net economic benefit. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to describe to you why those are the likely outcomes, at least one or the other. Whoops, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, my screen has frozen for a moment. There we go. To understand, first of all, what is being proposed by the hubs and what we hope the outcomes will be from them, we are, of course, trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. On the one hand, we want to and need to decarbonize. On the other hand, though, and largely for political reasons, the 2 hubs are being pitched as economic development engines, engines that will bring various forms of prosperity, inevitably starting with jobs, which seems to be the primary currency in policymaking discourse these days. And the hubs are supposed to make that kind of economic prosperity arise in 2 ways. First of all, we know that the hubs involve converting a lot of existing industries to hydrogen and carbon capture. And when I say a lot of industries, we'll run through a laundry list in a minute, but we hear it talked about with respect to steel and cement making, but also with respect to power generation, paper making, and a variety of other things. The problem is that converting existing facilities in any of those industries to hydrogen and its near relative carbon capture doesn't actually produce any net economic gain. It's because it doesn't increase the output. When you convert, for instance, a gas-fired power plant to hydrogen, or you install carbon capture in a gas-fired power plant, you don't actually increase the amount of electricity that's being produced. You just increase the cost for producing that energy. And so to that degree, it's an economic drag to implement either hydrogen or carbon capture in those circumstances. But the promise then that people hold out for eventual job growth and other economic benefits has to do with the notion that by developing the infrastructure, the pipelines that will be necessary to transport hydrogen and carbon, that infrastructure will help attract other industries to the region who want to take advantage of it. But of course, the problem there is that that means that we're depending upon downstream development to deliver jobs and other forms of economic benefit. And we know oftentimes they don't show up. And we'll come back to this example earlier or later on in the presentation, but probably in Pennsylvania, the most notorious case of downstream development not showing up is the Shell ethane cracker plant in Beaver County in Western Pennsylvania, which has had literally no measurable economic impact on the economy of Beaver County and no downstream development associated with it. And that is the reason why in the slide, if you look at the right-hand side, you see a lot of imagery from Shale Crescent, USA, and what was once upon the time the promise of the development of an petrochemical cluster in Western Pennsylvania and the greater Ohio Valley, which never came to fruition. And the significance of that is that it didn't come to fruition for the same reasons I was mentioning a moment ago about the hydrogen hub. When investors looked at the prospects for investing in petrochemical manufacturing in the region, they decided the risk wasn't worth it, despite the considerable efforts of the federal government to make it happen. And so to understand why the prospect of building out hydrogen hubs and carbon capture may not appeal very much to prospective investors, and why therefore those the visions that are being held out before us may never be realized, we just have to unbundle what a hydrogen hub is and what the necessary components are. And so, as Kanika was pointing out a few moments ago, there are a few different ways to make hydrogen that are reflected in the upper left-hand corner of the diagram. There is green hydrogen that's out there. Hydrogen can also be made by means of pyrolysis from coal. But overwhelmingly in the ARCH-2 hub, the Appalachian hub, the expectation is that hydrogen will be made by means of autothermal reforming or steam methane reforming from natural gas, from ethane. And that because that process does result in carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, it will be accompanied by carbon capture and sequestration. And so at the same time you're manufacturing hydrogen, you would also then necessarily have a carbon capture capability that would be added onto those facilities, and some means of transport to locations where that carbon would be sequestered underground. That might happen by truck in some cases, but certainly the long-term expectation is that it would happen by means of pipeline. But hydrogen isn't the only user of that, or prospective user of that carbon capture infrastructure. There's also an expectation that at least some coal-fired power plants and perhaps gas power plants might use it, and some factories, facilities like steel and cement facilities might also make use of underground carbon sequestration. And at the same time, we have that infrastructure. We have a second body of infrastructure, and that is pipelines necessary to carry hydrogen to various kinds of users. And if you've listened to, various policymakers, politicians, and spokespersons for the hydrogen hubs, you know that you'll hear about hydrogen possibly being used in a wide variety of applications. We hear steel and cement and fertilizer and kind of long haul shipping, but sometimes you'll hear policymakers talk about light transportation, cars and trucks. You hear about hydrogen being used to power homes and buildings. And you also hear about hydrogen being used in power generation. But the reality is that when you look at the economics of hydrogen, even hydrogen that's made with the benefit of these very substantial facilities from the federal government, the number of applications for which it's actually cost competitive are relatively few, even when you think cost competitive relative to other means of decarbonizing those sectors. So, for instance, battery-powered electric vehicles are far more cost-effective than hydrogen-powered vehicles. And similarly, electricity can be generated far more cost-effectively with renewable resources, wind and solar, supplemented by batteries and hydropower, than it can by hydrogen. And so, as a consequence, when we think about hydrogen and how it's going to be used, what you realize is that hydrogen won't be likely to get much of a foothold, if any, in the mass consumption applications. And by mass consumption, I'm talking about power generation, home heating, and transportation, at least light transportation, cars and trucks. And of course, the problem is if hydrogen doesn't play a role in those sectors, then there's not going to be all that much demand for it, because the remaining sectors, steel and cement, while they're important, obviously, and they do important things, they're not huge prospective users of hydrogen. And to understand why, I just want to throw a couple of numbers at you. And so, the first of those mass consumption sectors that I mentioned was power generation. In the case of power generation, there are two ways that theoretically you could take coal and gas-fired power plants and reduce their emissions. One is that you could do it by means of carbon capture. So the same carbon capture technology that would be used to manufacture blue hydrogen could be applied directly to coal and gas-fired power plants. The problem with that is if you apply carbon capture to a natural gas power plant, you literally double the cost of manufacturing electricity. And if you do it to a coal-fired power plant, you almost triple the cost of manufacturing electricity, to the point that you would actually pay that plant more to create and then capture carbon than you would to make the electricity that you're going to get as a result of it. And so for that reason, there's actually not much of an application or not much of a prospect of hydrogen or carbon capture playing as much of a role in the power sector, apart from the ability of federal subsidies to perhaps enable it to happen. And similarly, even if you're talking about hydrogen being used in gas-fired power plants, you discover that that's pretty darn expensive too. Certainly far more expensive than wind and solar power and other forms of generation. Literally, Lazard, that does a regular ongoing reporting of cost comparisons of energy resources, finds that if you were to blend just 20% hydrogen into a natural gas plant, that you would nearly double the cost of power generation in that plant. And you would only reduce its carbon emissions by about 7%. And so in both cases, this is why a number of observers have looked at hydrogen in the power sector and concluded, no, it's just probably not going to play there. And of course, then you have the dearth of demand that I talked about. You end up with a situation in which if those mass consumption applications don't use very much hydrogen, you're confined to just a few remaining applications. The problem is that even with the very, very generous subsidy provided by the Inflation Reduction Act, for most industries, carbon capture still does not make economic sense. And that then creates the problem that I talked about before, where if you can't figure out how to overcome this problem, then you don't have the investors coming to the table, and you can't afford to build the infrastructure that's necessary to support the hydrogen hubs that we're talking about. And so as a result of that, the Biden administration, the departments of energy in particular, are doing a number of things to try to encourage states to enact supplemental subsidies to those that have already been provided by the Inflation Reduction Act. They are doing things like encouraging states to assume liability for carbon capture and hydrogen operations. They're trying to persuade states to commit to offtake agreements in which they would basically agree to pay more than the market value of electricity or other products that are made using hydrogen or carbon capture in order to build a market up for them. And they're also asking for local tax favors. They're asking for the use of eminent domain to help develop the infrastructure. And they're asking states and localities to assume liability for accidents that may result from the development of hydrogen and carbon capture, all of which are subsidies that can be translated into dollars and cents. And so, the amount of money that we're talking about here between the Inflation Reduction Act, we mentioned already that the ARCH2 and MACH2 hubs are getting close to $1 billion each, never mind the other 7 hydrogen hubs. But also consider, as I said before, even for the 7 or $8 billion that the federal government is pouring into them, that's just the beginning of the federal subsidies. And it's just the beginning of the amount of capital that will be required. The ARCH2 and hydrogen, and the ARCH2 and MACH2 hydrogen hubs, between them will probably require almost $20 billion of investment before they're fully realized, if that day ever comes. What's astonishing is how little we're going to get back in return for that investment. Because when you look at the outcomes that have been advertised by ARCH2 and MACH2, you realize that between them, they're only expected to avoid about 10 million metric tons of hydrogen annually. 9 million of that comes from ARCH2 and just 1 million from MACH2. What's interesting about that is that the combined 10 million tons of hydrogen that they avoid won't even offset the emissions of a single coal-fired power plant. In fact, 10 million metric tons represents less than 2% of the carbon emissions that come from the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Delaware that are involved in the hubs. And I think that also includes New Jersey, by the way. But in any case, the hubs are actually going to have a relatively minimal impact on carbon emissions either in our region, but even nationally, because while Arch 2 and Mach 2 are going to, if realized, avoid about 10 million metric tons, even if you take all 7 of the hydrogen hubs and you put them together, they will only avoid about 25 million metric tons a year. And nationally, we produce about 4.5 billion tons. It's a very, very small impact on total emissions. And then finally, I had mentioned that the economic impacts are probably not going to be great. And I mentioned earlier the Shell cracker, which is an interesting point of comparison for Arch 2 and Mach 2 because it's a project of comparable size when you look at the amount of money that has been invested to build the Shell ethane cracker. And despite that fact, we see that the Shell ethane cracker has had no measurable effect on jobs in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, or on economic activity generally in that region. And, frankly, we can do a digression into the reasons why, but it has to do with the fact that the Shell cracker is like many of the facilities that would be built as part of a hydrogen hub, is a very capital intensive, but not a very labor intensive enterprise. And so even though in Kanika's presentation, she had pointed out that there are between them 30-some thousand jobs that they're talking about associated with the Mach 2 and Arch 2 hydrogen hubs, about 90% of those jobs are in construction and would only be relevant for a year or two while the various infrastructure components of the hubs are built. After that, the number of jobs provided by the 2 hubs would only be about 7,000, which is a remarkably small number. To put it in context, Pennsylvania alone has over 5 million jobs. Never mind the combination of Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and New Jersey. Then you're over 15 million jobs. 7,000 jobs in that context is not even a rounding error. And so the takeaway from this is that the hubs, first of all, are far from certain that they will be fully realized as described, because as we've seen before, whether it was with the Appalachian Storage Hub and the petrochemical renaissance before it, these were visions that were talked about that received considerable amounts of funding, but never came to fruition. Or we also have the example of the natural gas boom in Appalachia, which was realized, but which again had minimal economic benefit for the region. And so as we go forward, talking about the hydrogen hubs and what kinds of policies we want to enact, the question isn't so much how can we make the hydrogen hubs happen as it is how can we avoid spending too much to try to bring about something that will make relatively few contributions to either carbon reduction or to economic prosperity. And so with that, I'll be happy to join the discussion, but thank you very much.
All right, we're going to transition into a bit of a Q&A now. If you have any questions for Sean or any of us, please drop them in the chat. We'll just see what rolls in. I guess I can get the questions started. I was wondering if there are any places that currently kind of like main hydrogen. Is there anyone to look to during a transition of like what hydrogen would look like when it's fully developed?
Well, I'll take a run at that. we can look at some of the projects that have been proposed for the hydrogen hubs. And, we should keep in mind, by the way, that both hydrogen hubs are less a single entity than they are a collection of projects, some of which are on the production side of hydrogen, meaning whether it's manufacturing hydrogen from methane, or doing it via electrolysis from water. But there are also projects that are on the consumption side. And so in the case of the Arch 2 hub, there have been a few facilities that have been proposed to manufacture hydrogen from methane, one of them in Mason County, West Virginia, another in Pike County, Ohio, and there will certainly be others coming along. And in Mach 2, I haven't heard yet specifically of specific facilities that are being funded at this point. And so I'd be curious, frankly, if anybody knows of any. But on the consumption side, we know that, again, in the case of Arch 2, they have identified a total of 15 different projects, some of which are in the power generating sector as conceivable users. One is in the household power sector, and there are a few that are in various manufacturing sectors that would use hydrogen theoretically, including cement making and steel.
All right, looks like we have a question in the chat from Keon.
Mhm.
Says, what about producing hydrogen with renewable energy? Are there no allocations in the IRA or the hubs for producing H2 without CCS or fossil fuels?
Yeah, sure, there are. The specific for the production of hydrogen, there's a very specific tax credit. It's kind of universally referred to as 45V, which is the section of the code. And 45V sets up a kind of technology neutral tax credit for hydrogen production. The tax credit offers different levels of subsidy depending upon how clean your production process is. Because, as was pointed out earlier, when hydrogen is burned, once it's hydrogen, and then it's used, it's not going to emit any emissions. The question is how it's produced and how much carbon is emitted in the production process. And so there are, in the 45V tax credit, there are 4 tiers of subsidy that are available that range from about 60 cents per kilogram of hydrogen up to $3 per kilogram, depending upon how much how much carbon is emitted in the manufacturing process. Green hydrogen, which is made from water using electrolysis, and in which there are basically no emissions, would qualify under the IRA for the full $3 subsidy. Most blue hydrogen from methane, depending on how it's produced and where the power is acquired to drive the either steam methane or autothermal reforming process, would probably only qualify for 60 to 75 cents per kilogram in subsidies. So yeah, green hydrogen is going to get a much, much larger subsidy than blue hydrogen would.
Thank you. I think we have a couple more questions. Jarell and Sana have kind of a similar question, is like, if you could expand on a better use of these funds for developing clean energy, if instead of hydrogen, or if it was hydrogen, what would be a better use of these funds?
Well, the question is one of how hydrogen is going to be used and therefore what level of support it should get. If hydrogen is confined to the areas in which it's either the only or the most cost-effective means of decarbonization, then you're talking about, a much smaller amount of money because there'd be much less hydrogen made or consumed. If you get hydrogen into the categories, the mass consumption categories that I mentioned, like power generation or home heating, or automobiles, then it's going to become far more costly and far more unnecessarily costly because in those sectors, we have means of decarbonization that are, frankly, a lot less expensive and that would do a much better job of it in terms of reducing emissions, particularly compared with blue hydrogen.
Got it. I think we have one more from Kian. He's, are there any countries in the world with a developed or ideal hydrogen economies or industries?
No. um, you have to consider that hydrogen is kind of a niche product right now in terms of the ways in which it's used. There are a few industries, notably the manufacture of fertilizers, where hydrogen is absolutely essential. And it's used in some sort of transportation related issues. There are places, for instance, where forklifts are powered by hydrogen, um, and a few other very specific and niche applications. And so when you talk about an H2, a hydrogen economy, the answer is no, not really, because it is, confined to just a few applications, typically speaking. And that's frankly a function of its relative inefficiency for most forms of power generation. I mean, I did a presentation a while back in which I pointed out that hydrogen is one of the oldest fuels that we have at our disposal. In fact, the first um, powered engine, horseless carriage, was actually powered by hydrogen in 1807. It's been with us for a really long time, but it's not used in any of those mass consumption applications simply because there have been alternatives that are much more efficient and cheaper, whether it's gasoline in the case of cars, or natural gas to heat homes. Hydrogen has never been able to compete effectively with any of those things outside of just a relatively small number of niche applications. So, no, there really isn't any kind of ideal hydrogen economy out there.
Okay, I think we have Reed who has raised his hand, and if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, hey, thanks for doing this, Sean. Good to see you. Um, I've been seeing a lot of, not a lot, but I've been seeing some sort of statements, emails, etc., from like the natural gas industry and their sort of surrogates in government, complaining about the new treasury rules.
Yep.
That, I mean, there's a complaint that from the hydrogen industry about like the green hydrogen rules, which don't really apply so much to the Arch 2 development, but probably to the Mach 2, about where the green hydrogen comes from, when the solar energy gets the three pillars that people have talked about. But I'm seeing more and more of these complaints from like the gas world that the Treasury rules, not the IRA, but the Treasury rules are not fair enough to gas. And I'm like, I don't understand what they're talking about. It's very vague. They don't point to anything. I mean, I haven't like done a ton of digging on it, like, but you get politicians from Pennsylvania sending out these emails saying we're concerned about they're not seeing the role of gas. Do you know what's going on, or are there? are there subsidies that you're worried that we're about to walk into, in sort of like the 11th hour of these rules right before an election, yada yada, that you're worried about in particular?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, the issue that's being fought about goes back to what I described a moment ago, which is that the IRA created a tiered subsidy system for hydrogen in which you can get as much as $3 a kilogram or as little, well, as little as zero if you don't hit a minimum
Yeah.
uh, emission reduction level, but as little as 60 cents. And it was the Treasury Department, IRS, that was left with the responsibility of figuring out how it would calculate the emissions associated with each manufacturing process. And it's in the arcane discussions about that that the conflict that you're talking about is arising because, of course, making hydrogen from methane does typically involve, considerably more emissions in the process than making it from water, from using electrolyzers to do it. And so those rules will determine what level of subsidy or whether some kinds of hydrogen are even eligible for a subsidy. So in simple terms, that's the essence of the dispute about how Treasury is going to decide to count the emissions associated with making hydrogen in different ways. Does that?
So yeah, I think so. I mean, I did a story a few weeks ago on this and got into it with the one of the Congress people who's been writing about this, and their office said something about they were concerned that now this isn't that making electrolytic hydrogen, but with electricity from a natural gas plant that has had CCS, that they were worried about that not being um
Yeah,
like part that's been disadvantaged to like solar power or something. Like it's starting to get really like, whoa, like very arcane.
Yeah, and the reason behind that is that electrolysis, which is the process used to extract hydrogen
Yeah,
from water, is a very power-intensive exercise. It
yeah,
uses a lot of electricity. And the question is, where's that electricity going to come from? Is it going to come from wind and solar, which is clean, or is it going to come from the grid, typically, which in the case of Pennsylvania inevitably means a lot of gas-fired power, some nuclear power, and even still some coal power? And the way the law is written, or at least the way the guidelines that Treasury has published on a preliminary basis have been set, is that those upstream emissions from gas-fired power plants and coal would, count toward the limit and would therefore reduce theoretically the incentive um, to manufacture hydrogen, in this case, by means of electrolysis. But it would specifically mean that for those who are going out there and trying to manufacture green hydrogen, they will look exclusively for power from renewable resources, wind and solar, and not at all from um, gas-fired power plants. And yeah, that distresses people who produce natural gas and who operate gas-fired power plants. And depending on, if CCS is used, then you run into the question of, okay, well, how effective is carbon capture, which, is talked about capturing 90% plus of emissions, but which in actual application typically has not achieved that level of reduction.
yeah. And they just I was just reading some of the power plant rule comments, and one of the things, one of the reasons the industry said the power plant rules were no good is they require CCS, and they said that basically CCS doesn't really work economically for us. So I don't know if that applies to hydrogen per se, but at least in the power sector,
No, and they're right. I don't know when you came in, but I talked a little bit about, CCS in the power sector is right now, even with the expanded 45Q subsidy of $85 per metric ton, it's still cost prohibitive for both coal and gas-fired power at this point.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Bill, I think I see that you've raised your hand. Just to be mindful of time, if you could be quick, we would really appreciate that.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thank y'all so much, and thank y'all so much for putting this together. This is really a fantastic discussion about, especially like this hydrogen. The question I had was kind of about the history of the events and the projects that you talked about that were in the Ohio Valley, and what are some of the recommendations you would have for kind of the organizers and the people that are in this room that are going to be, looking towards that Pennsylvania future in the projects that will be happening? How can we make sure that those projects aren't going to fall to waste and that we actually have, the inspiration to make sure that they're going ahead and making sure these projects are going to be done the right way? If not this project, the next project afterwards will be done in the right way to make sure that, we're not just wasting corporate billions into these dumps. What would you recommend for for us for these next steps?
Okay, first of all, if anybody else here is more expert than I am in the Department of Energy's engagement process with communities, and there is a very formal engagement process around the hydrogen hubs that the Department of Energy has put out there, I would be more than grateful for that person to kick in and talk about that process a little bit. I know some of it, but I'm not that expert in it. Is there anybody else here who is particularly conversant in the engagement process? Okay, well, in that case, I'll do the best I can, and if somebody wants to interrupt, please do. Um, okay, so there's kind of an official answer to the question you asked, and then there's the unofficial one. The official answer is, and you can go and I will share after this is over a link. There is an official DOE engagement process that's taking place. The two hydrogen hubs will only receive the funding that's been announced over a period of a couple of years, and they will have to hit benchmarks in order to do that. And the benchmarks have to do with, among other things, public engagement. And these are occasions when, anybody from the public can get to comment on and potentially strike deals. And they're specifically encouraging the projects that are part of the hydrogen hubs to strike community benefit agreements in which people, the project sponsors will address concerns that may exist around possible environmental or quality of life impacts or things like that. Now, and so I'm sure we'll have some means of sharing with you links to that process so that you can get involved in it. Now, having said that, right, the problems with the process are two. The first one is that much of the process will only kick in after the major decisions have been made concerning the various projects. The first major decision, of course, is will they go forward or not? And then the second major decision is on what terms, what will be the moving components, how much raw material, whether it's methane or something else, will be going in, how much hydrogen will be going out, what will the emissions associated with that project be, both not just the greenhouse gas emissions, but the local emissions that have real effects on people's health in the community, and what are the implications of all that. The problem is that most of those decisions will have actually been effectively made by the time the formal engagement process kicks in. And so that's why, my organization is right now, we're a think tank. We're not an advocacy organization, but we are trying to assist local organizations and local advocates to begin engaging directly with the prospective sponsors of hydrogen-related projects right now outside of the federal process so that the train hasn't left the station. And that's hard to do. And it's hard to do because, each project is its own little thing, and the companies may or may not have any obligations individually to engage with people in the community. And so that's a challenging undertaking, frankly. But I hope we can figure out a way, folks that who are sponsoring this, if we could perhaps post or send out to people afterward contact information for the DOE engagement process.
Sure. Okay, I think we're gonna close out the question section. I'm gonna hand it off to Gabby to take it forward from here.
All right, guys. Thank you guys for spending so much time with us tonight. Thank you, Sean, for sharing your expertise on this new and evolving topic. Thank you, everyone who attended, and thank you for lending us your ear. I hope you all had the chance to learn something new tonight. We're just going to send it off with a couple of our upcoming events. So if you liked us so much that you want to keep hanging out tonight, we're watching the State of the Union together on Zoom at 8:15. We're going to have Biden bingo and some prizes. And then we have an upcoming event on Tuesday, March 12th from A to C, the connection between agriculture and conservation with Senator Bob Casey. It's going to be a lunch and learn talking about the Farm Bill and the connection between agriculture and conservation. And then on Saturday, March 16th, we have a cleanup. If you are located in Philadelphia, it's going to be in West Philadelphia at Malcolm X Park from 1 to 3. And then every Wednesday, we have climate chats from 5:30 to 7. This is an open office hours type event that you can bring your climate concerns and we can send you in the right direction. But on that note, we're going to close it out tonight. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Jessica, Kanika, and Sean.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.